Right now, on March 12th, a war that started 12 days ago has already produced a military statistic that no analyst had publicly forecast before it happened. Iran logged over 90 confirmed strike attempts against Israel in the first 5 days, February 28th through March 4th, per Aclid's verified conflict database. Not warning shots, not test launches. 90 tracked and geolocated strike events, confirmed by independent conflict monitors and Israeli defense officials on the ground. For historical context, during the entire 8-year Iran-Iraq war, Iraq launched roughly 190 Scud missiles total at Iranian cities across the full duration of that conflict. Iran delivered nearly half that 8-year total against a single country in 5 days, targeting a nation with the most expensive layered air defense system active anywhere on Earth. That number, 90 strike events in 5 days, is what this video is built around, and by the end, you will see exactly why it reshapes the strategic picture for every government watching. Let's start with the day-by-day breakdown, because the pattern across those 5 days reveals something more important than any single headline from this week captured. On February 28th, hours after U.S. and Israeli forces launched strikes across Iran, Israeli broadcaster Kan 11 reported roughly 90 ballistic missiles fired toward Israel in a single day. The following day, the count dropped to around 65. By days, 3 through 5, daily volume settled at roughly 20 to 25 missiles per day, per Times of Israel reporting on March 10th. That descending curve is not retreat. Analysts point to 2 simultaneous factors operating in parallel, and understanding both changes the entire picture of what Iran is actually executing. The first factor is physical. U.S. and Israeli strikes targeted mobile launchers inside Iran. By March 10th, the IDF reported destroying over 300 ballistic missile launchers, about 65% of Iran's total stockpile. The second factor is doctrinal. Iranian planners appear to have shifted toward deliberate conservation, preserving remaining stockpiles for a sustained campaign rather than exhausting them in the opening days. In my view, that doctrinal shift is the most important signal in the entire first week data. Iran is not running out, it is recalibrating for duration. Now let's talk about what those 90 strike attempts actually produced, because the damage picture is more complicated than either side's public statements fully acknowledge. ACLED's verified data shows roughly 20 of those 90-plus events involved direct hits on civilian areas in Israel, resulting in at least 10 confirmed deaths during that 5-day window alone. The single deadliest event in this conflict came on March 1st. An Iranian ballistic missile struck a synagogue and residential buildings in Beit Shemesh, 18 miles from Jerusalem, killing 9 civilians. What made Beit Shemesh analytically significant was not just the death toll. At least 2 interceptors had already been launched against that specific incoming missile before it struck and hit anyway. That single event illustrated in concrete terms what analysts call the statistical limits of layered interception. No system maintains a perfect kill rate under sustained high-volume fire. Israel runs a multi-tier architecture. Iron Dome handles short-range threats, David's Sling targets medium-range ballistic missiles, and the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 systems intercept at high altitude. In April 2024, Congress approved an $8.7 billion package for Israel, $5.2 billion earmarked for air defense assets, which directly funded Iron Dome interceptor stockpiles and production replenishment. And yet across 90 attempts in 5 days, the system absorbed impacts that produced confirmed civilian casualties, not because it failed fundamentally, but because the volume stressed every tier simultaneously. Saturation is the technical term. It occurs when the rate of incoming threats approaches or exceeds the reload and engagement capacity of the interceptor batteries on the receiving end. Iron Dome's Tammer interceptors cost approximately $40,000 to $50,000 per missile, according to Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and Defense Industry Reporting from JNS, published in 2025. Iran's drone platforms cost far less per unit to produce. Iran entered this conflict with an estimated 2,500 ballistic missiles, per pre-war assessments cited by ACLED and multiple defense analysts covering the region. In my view, that cost asymmetry, not the geopolitical rhetoric, is the structural logic that made 90 strikes in 5 days operationally coherent from Iran's planning perspective. It is not primarily about destroying specific targets. It is about forcing Israel to spend high-value interceptors at a rate that strains both forward stockpiles and production capacity simultaneously. What this suggests is that Iran's campaign designers were not chasing a single decisive blow. They were running a sustained logistics pressure test against the most expensive air defense system on Earth. The early results are already reshaping calculations in Washington, Riyadh, and every Gulf capital watching this from what they had hoped was a safe distance. If this analysis is why you watch this channel, hit, like right now, drop a comment. Given the first 5 days, can this defense architecture absorb weeks of sustained pressure, or is saturation Iran's actual endgame? Because next we break down exactly what Iran fired, system by system, and what the targeting pattern across those 90 events reveals about where this campaign is designed to go from here. Stay with me. The weapons breakdown reframes what those 90 strikes actually mean and points directly at where this conflict is headed next. Here's the detail that almost every news outlet covering this conflict has completely buried under the daily missile count headlines. Roughly half of all the ballistic missiles Iran has fired at Israel in this war have been carrying cluster munitions, not standard warheads. The IDF Home Front Command confirmed that figure publicly on March 10th, and it fundamentally changes the military logic of what Iran has been doing over these 12 days. Here is why that matters. A standard ballistic missile carries one warhead. It hits one point. It can be tracked, intercepted, or if it gets through, it damages one location. A missile equipped with a cluster warhead works entirely differently. It opens at altitude, between 7 and 10 kilometers above ground, and releases dozens of individual bomblets across a wide radius. According to the IDF, Iranian cluster warheads in this conflict contain between 20 and 24 bomblets each, spreading across an area of up to 10 kilometers in radius on impact. What that means in practice: even a missile that gets intercepted mid-flight can still release its submunitions before destruction, and those bomblets continue falling. Missile expert Tal Inbar, consulting for Israeli defense firms, told CNN that in some cases, arrow interceptors hit the parent missile, but the bomblets had already been deployed before the intercept connected. That is a design feature, not a flaw. Iran's engineers specifically built these warheads to separate before intercept geometry can close, turning a defensive success into a partial failure simultaneously. The IDF confirmed that Iran has been deploying cluster munitions on a nearly daily basis since February 28th, with the first confirmed strike occurring on the opening day of the conflict itself. On March 9th, 2 construction workers were killed in Yehud, near Tel Aviv, struck outdoors by submunitions from one of these warheads, while they were working at a site during an alert. The Convention on Cluster Munitions, signed by over 100 countries, bans these weapons for their indiscriminate dispersal pattern. Iran, Israel, and the United States have not signed that treaty. Now let's talk about the specific missile systems Iran has been using, because understanding the hardware explains why the interception math is harder than the public numbers suggest. The core system in Iran's opening campaign was the K-bar-Shekin, a solid-fuel medium-range ballistic missile with a reported range of around 1,450 kilometers per CSIS missile specifications. Solid fuel is the key engineering detail. Liquid-fueled missiles require hours of preparation, fueling, pressurization, checks, all visible to surveillance satellites watching for launch activity. The K-bar-Shekin runs on solid propellant that is already loaded at the factory. The launcher arrives at a site, the missile goes vertical, and it can fire in minutes, not hours. That compressed launch window matters enormously for the defenders trying to destroy these systems before they fire, a strategy the US and Israel have been executing aggressively inside Iran. The K-bar-Shekin carries a maneuverable re-entry vehicle. Its warhead adjusts trajectory in the terminal phase, during the exact window when Arrow and David's sling are calculating their intercept geometry. The adjustment is not dramatic in distance, but it is enough to introduce uncertainty into the intercept solution at exactly the moment when the defense system needs precision most. Iran also deployed the Sagil, a 2-stage solid-fuel missile with a declared range of approximately 2,000 kilometers, the longest-range confirmed solid-fuel ballistic missile in Iran's current operational inventory. The Sagil's 2-stage design sheds weight mid-flight, maintaining thrust efficiency, making it capable of reaching Israel from deeper inside Iranian territory than single-stage systems. Then there is the Fatah family, the system Iran has marketed most aggressively, and which requires careful framing to explain accurately without simply accepting or rejecting Iranian claims. The Fatah-1, used in combat since June 2025, is a ballistic missile with a maneuvering re-entry vehicle and a small rocket motor, not a true hypersonic glide vehicle, per Iran Watch and IISS analysts. Iran also deployed the Fatah-2 for the first time on March 1st. Unlike the Fatah-1, the Fatah-2 uses a hypersonic glide vehicle that maneuvers throughout atmospheric flight, per Military Watch reporting. In my view, what matters operationally is this: both systems alter trajectory in ways that differ from the standard ballistic arc that Arrow and David's sling algorithms were originally designed to track. What this suggests is that Iran's missile mix was not random. Each system stressed a different layer. The K-bar-Shekin for volume and mobility, the Sagil for range, the Fatah for terminal unpredictability. As Iran's launcher inventory was degraded by US and Israeli strikes, cluster munitions became the compensating mechanism. More damage per missile when fewer can be launched. In my view, that shift from volume fire toward per missile lethality as launcher counts fell is a clear signal that Iran's planners had modeled this exact degradation scenario well in advance. Next, we go to the number behind all of this hardware, the economic cost of 12 days of war. and why it is already moving markets in ways most financial coverage is not connecting to what you just heard. Stay with me. The cost side of this equation reframes every other number in this conflict and points at something most analysts are still avoiding. March 9th, 2026. Oil markets opened in Asia, and within minutes, Brent crude surged past $119 a barrel for the first time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That happened in a single trading session, and it was not the peak. It was the opening move of what analysts were calling an unprecedented energy shock. Before February 28th, the day U.S. and Israeli strikes began, Brent was trading around $70 a barrel. In 10 days, the price of oil rose nearly 70%. That is not a market reacting to a war. That is a market pricing in a potential restructuring of the entire global energy supply architecture. The mechanism was not the strikes on Iran's military infrastructure directly. It was one body of water, the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is a 21-mile wide choke point between Iran and Oman at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the narrowest passage in the world's most critical energy corridor. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply transits that waterway every single day. About 20 million barrels per day, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. When Iran effectively closed the strait to commercial shipping in retaliation for the strikes, that supply did not disappear. It simply stopped moving. Tankers anchored offshore. Crude piled up at loading terminals in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and Kuwait, with no legal and safe route to exit. Within days, storage capacity at Gulf export terminals began approaching its physical limits, and producer nations faced a choice no oil ministry ever wants to make. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq did not cut production because they chose to. They cut production because they ran out of room to store what they were pumping. Iraq's 3 main southern oil fields, which normally produce 4.3 million barrels per day, had fallen to just 1.3 million barrels per day by March 9th, according to 3 industry officials cited by Reuters. That is a 70% output collapse in one of OPEC's largest members, caused not by sanctions or political decisions, but by a tanker queue with no exit point. In my view, this is the most underreported fact of the entire conflict. The strait closure did not just raise prices, it physically broke the supply chain of multiple producer nations at once. The International Energy Agency responded by authorizing the largest release of emergency oil reserves in its history, 400 million barrels from the strategic stockpiles of IEA member countries. For context, that is roughly 20 days of Hormuz traffic. It was designed to stabilize the market, but analysts were clear about what it could and could not do. Amina Bakr, head of OPEC Plus and Middle East Insights at the trade intelligence group Kepler, said the reserve release could have an impact on prices, but described it as small and short-term. Tyler Goodspeed, chief economist at ExxonMobil, told CNBC that the more probable scenario was the strait remaining effectively closed harder and longer than markets had initially priced in. Janav Shah, Rystad Energy's vice president for oil markets, published a note projecting Brent could reach $135 per barrel if current conditions persist for approximately 4 months. What this suggests is that the market was not pricing in the war itself. It was pricing in duration uncertainty, and every additional day of closure shifts that probability distribution further. The financial spillover was immediate and global. On March 9th, Japan's Nikkei 225 fell more than 5%, dropping as much as 7% intraday before partially recovering. South Korea's Kospi dropped 6% in the same session. U.S. stock futures tied to the S&P 500 fell 1.7%, while NASDAQ futures declined 1.9% in after-hours trading. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had already lost over 400 points on March 2nd, the first full trading day after the strikes began, and that was before oil had crossed $100. There was a clear split inside equity markets. Exxon and Chevron rose pre-market while broad indices fell, and defense stocks, including Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin, also gained strongly. This pattern mirrors every major Middle East disruption since 1973. Energy producers and defense contractors benefit while the broader consumer economy faces headwinds from higher input costs. Europe faced a separate and compounding pressure point. On March the 2nd, Iranian-linked drones attacked Qatari gas facilities, and Qatar Energy announced a full halt of gas production in the country. Qatar supplies roughly 20% of the world's LNG, and its sudden exit from the market hit European consumers within hours. European natural gas prices nearly doubled in the days that followed, adding cost pressure to households and fertilizer producers already strained by the energy shock. Paul Gooden, head of Global Natural Resources at 91, wrote in a note that even in a de-escalation scenario, oil prices were unlikely to return to the $60–$70 range that prevailed before the war. In my view, that assessment reflects a structural shift rather than a temporary spike. The market has repriced Gulf supply risk permanently. A new and persistent risk premium for Persian Gulf oil does not fully reset when the shooting stops, and analysts across the board acknowledge this. What this suggests is that the economic fallout extends well beyond the duration of any military campaign, reshaping energy costs, insurance rates, and consumer inflation globally. Energy prices, shipping insurance, fertilizer costs, airline surcharges, and consumer inflation are all now recalibrating in every import-dependent economy on Earth. The next section covers what the combination of a sustained missile campaign and a fractured energy market means for the broader strategic picture going forward. Here's the question that frames everything you just heard across the first three sections, and it is a question no analyst has cleanly answered yet. Iran has now fired over 90 missiles at Israel, deployed cluster munitions on a near-daily basis, and effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz to most commercial shipping. Iran also claimed the first combat use of the Fateh-2 hypersonic glide vehicle, a claim reported by Iranian state media, but not independently confirmed by Western sources as of March 12th. And as of March 12th, the war is still going. Iran has not surrendered, and its new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, son of the assassinated Ali Khamenei, has assumed power. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians rallied in Tehran in his support, according to Al Jazeera's March 10th reporting, a signal that the regime's internal cohesion has not collapsed. Layer 1, Iran demonstrated that even a badly degraded missile force can impose real costs on the most expensive air defense architecture in the world. The Beit Shemesh strike on March 1st, 9 killed despite 2 interceptors already launched, proved that saturation works even at reduced volume. That single data point was worth more to Iran strategically than any target destroyed. It showed every government watching that money and technology do not create an impenetrable shield. By March 9th, the IDF had destroyed over 300 Iranian launchers, roughly 65% of the pre-war total, per IDF reporting, confirmed by Critical Threats and the Institute for the Study of War. But critically, Iran had also demonstrated to its domestic audience and to every regional actor that it could absorb a campaign of this scale and keep firing for 12 days and counting. Layer 2 is the interceptor math, and this is where the strategic picture becomes uncomfortable for Washington in ways that official statements do not fully acknowledge. According to a New York Times report cited by Wikipedia's conflict documentation, Iranian attacks caused damage to at least 17 U.S. sites in the Middle East by March 11th. For each Iranian projectile, the U.S. and Israel typically fire 2 to 3 interceptors, at $4 million per Patriot or $12–15 million per Theeda, versus roughly $50,000 to produce a Shahed drone. Tom Caraco, director of the CSIS Missile Defense Project, said at a CSIS event on March 5th that reconciliation procurement quantities for SM-3s and Tomahawks were nowhere near enough. He added that he would not be surprised if a comparable number of those munitions had already been consumed in just the first few days of Operation Epic Fury. His direct words, delivered at the March 5th event, "Get stuff on contract and get it going fast, because at current consumption rates, the clock is ticking." Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated on March the 2nd that Iran had been producing over 100 ballistic missiles per month before the war began. What this suggests is that even with 65% of its launchers destroyed, Iran's residual production capacity complicates the simple narrative of a campaign that is close to over. Now let's look at the diplomatic layer, because as of March 12th, the path to ending this conflict is not clear, and both sides are publicly committed to positions that are structurally incompatible. Bloomberg reported on March 11th that Iran told regional intermediaries it would only agree to a ceasefire if the U.S. and Israel guarantee they will never strike Iran again in the future. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said the only way to end the war is recognizing Iran's legitimate rights, payment of reparations, and firm international guarantees against future aggression. Trump has called for Iran's unconditional surrender and described the conflict as a campaign for regime change, a position the White House has not walked back despite back-channel contacts. Iran reached out to the CIA for terms, according to reporting by the Jerusalem Post, a signal that at least part of the regime was probing for an exit. But Trump acknowledged directly that the pool of potential interlocutors was shrinking, noting that most of the people we had in mind are dead. In my view, that single statement from Trump contains the core structural problem of the entire endgame. The campaign's own logic undermines the conditions needed to end it. The more aggressively strikes degrade Iran's leadership structure, the less capable any remaining institution is of enforcing a ceasefire, even if one is formally reached. China sent a special envoy to the region last week to mediate, and Russia's Putin called Iran's new leader, pledging unwavering support. Neither country has offered anything that closes the gap between Trump's demand for unconditional surrender and Tehran's demand for security guarantees. What this suggests is that the 90 missiles fired in the first 5 days were not designed as the opening move of a short and decisive conflict. They were the opening argument in a longer pressure campaign designed to impose costs, demonstrate resilience, and force a negotiated outcome Iran can frame as something other than capitulation. This is a war where one side has overwhelming air power, and the other has the willingness to absorb it and keep shooting regardless of the cost. As of March 12, 2026, 12 days in, none of those four things have run out on either side, and that is the most important fact in the entire picture. If you want to track how this unfolds, the interceptor stockpile math, the strait still effectively closed to most commercial shipping, and the ceasefire gap no mediator has yet bridged, subscribe now. Hit the notification bell. The next video covers what the second week of this conflict revealed, and what the data says about where this campaign's real ceiling is.